This story is titled, "She Swore Her Son Was Innocent and Fought the Entire School to Defend Him, Until the Teacher Revealed Security Footage That Changed Everything She Thought She Knew About Her Child." I'm Andrea, 39F, a single mom living in Ashland, Oregon, where I've spent the last 15 years building what I thought was the perfect life for my son, Lucas, 16M. Working as a real estate agent gave me the flexibility to be there for every moment of his childhood, from soccer games to science fairs. Lucas was always the kind of kid other parents dreamed of, having straight A's, captain of the debate team, and never a hint of trouble. Mrs. Thompson, 52F, Lucas's English teacher at Ashland High School, had always praised his work ethic and leadership skills. Even our principal, Mr. Davidson, 45M, would use Lucas as an example during parent-teacher conferences of what an ideal student should be. My son had a tight-knit group of friends, including his best friend since elementary school, Ryan, 16M, and they were all high achievers like him. Life was going exactly as I'd planned it. I'd managed to overcome the heartbreak of Lucas's father walking out when our son was just 2 years old, and I'd poured everything into making sure Lucas had the stability and support he needed. Our modest 3-bedroom house near the high school was filled with his academic awards and debate team trophies. Every morning, I'd watch him walk to school with his perfectly pressed clothes and his backpack full of completed homework, feeling proud of the young man he was becoming. That's why when I got the call from the school that Wednesday afternoon in October, I was sure there had to be some mistake. The secretary's voice was tense as she asked me to come in for an emergency meeting with Mr. Davidson. Something about an incident involving Lucas and another student, Nick, 15M, during lunch period. I remember laughing it off, telling her there must be some confusion. My Lucas would never be involved in any incident. I had no idea that walking through those school doors that afternoon would shatter everything I thought I knew about my perfect son. But sometimes the hardest truths come from the places we least expect them, and the image we hold of those closest to us can turn out to be nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. Let me tell you about the day my world turned upside down, and how a simple piece of security footage forced me to confront the reality that sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones we don't really know at all. When I arrived at Ashland High that afternoon, the atmosphere was different from the usual warm welcome I received. The front office staff avoided eye contact, and Mrs. Rodriguez, 43F, the usually chatty secretary, simply gestured toward Mr. Davidson's office with a grim expression. Inside, I found not just Mr. Davidson, but also Mrs. Thompson, the school counselor Ms. Chin, 35F, and Officer Miller, 38M, our school resource officer. My heart started racing, but I maintained my composure. Nick's parents, the Wilsons, were there too. His mother Jennifer, 41F, looked like she'd been crying, while his father Tom, 42F, sat with barely contained anger. The story they told me seemed absurd. According to them, Lucas had been systematically bullying Nick for months. They claimed he'd been extorting money from Nick, threatening to reveal some embarrassing information if he didn't pay. The final straw came during lunch period when Nick finally refused to pay, and Lucas allegedly pushed him down a flight of stairs. I immediately jumped to Lucas's defense. This had to be a misunderstanding, or worse, a false accusation. My son was a model student who mentored younger kids. He'd never hurt anyone. I pointed out his perfect record, his leadership roles, his volunteer work at the local library. I even pulled out my phone to show them pictures from last month's debate tournament where Lucas had won first place. The more they tried to tell me about the evidence they had, the more defensive I became. I accused Nick of lying, suggested he might have fallen on his own, and was trying to blame Lucas. I even implied that perhaps the Wilsons were trying to extort money from us, knowing I was a successful real estate agent. Mr. Davidson kept trying to interject, mentioning something about security footage, but I was too caught up in my righteousness to listen. I demanded to see Lucas, to hear his side of the story. When they brought him in, he looked shocked and scared, exactly what I'd expect from an innocent boy being falsely accused. He shook his head when they repeated the accusations, and I felt even more certain that this was all a terrible mistake. That's when Mr. Davidson quietly said the words that would change everything. "I think it's time we review the security footage." He reached for his computer mouse, and I sat there, still absolutely confident that this video would vindicate my son and expose this whole situation for the farce I believed it to be. I had no idea that the next few minutes would completely destroy the image of the perfect child I'd built up in my mind over 16 years. The footage started playing on Mr. Davidson's monitor, and my world began to crumble piece by piece. The timestamp showed lunch period from 3 weeks ago. I watched as Lucas, my perfect, kind, honor student Lucas, cornered Nick behind the gymnasium where he thought no cameras could see. The angle was clear, showing Lucas's face as he aggressively pushed Nick against the wall, hand outstretched, demanding something. Nick shakily pulled out his wallet. Mr. Davidson fast-forwarded through multiple similar incidents over the past 2 months. Each clip showed the same pattern: Lucas intimidating Nick in different secluded spots around the school. Sometimes Ryan would act as a lookout. The timestamps matched perfectly with Nick's odd behavior that I'd noticed but dismissed, like when he started taking different routes to school or when he suddenly quit the academic bowl team that Lucas captained. But nothing prepared me for the footage from today. The camera angle showed the empty stairwell during lunch period. Nick appeared first, walking quickly, clutching his backpack. Lucas followed, looking angry. When Nick turned and said something, shaking his head, Lucas's face contorted with rage, an expression I'd never seen on my son's face before. The push was deliberate, calculated. Nick tumbled down half a flight of stairs, his glasses shattering on impact. What broke me wasn't just watching my son's cruel actions, it was his reaction afterward. He didn't look shocked or remorseful. Instead, he calmly checked his surroundings, straightened his tie, and walked away, leaving Nick groaning on the floor. Another student found Nick 5 minutes later and ran for help. As the footage ended, I felt physically ill. The room was spinning, and all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. My mind desperately tried to find explanations, excuses, anything to deny what I just witnessed. But the evidence was irrefutable. The security cameras had captured a side of my son I never knew existed: a bully, an extortionist, someone capable of calculated violence. The worst part? When I finally looked at Lucas, really looked at him, I saw something in his eyes I had somehow missed all these years: not fear or remorse, but cold calculation, as he realized his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. In that moment, I understood that the perfect son I thought I knew was just an illusion, and the truth that was emerging was far more terrifying than any accusation I tried to defend against. The meeting continued as other students were called in to share their stories. Each new testimony felt like another knife in my heart. Emma, 16F, a quiet girl from Lucas's chemistry class, revealed how he threatened to expose personal information about her family unless she wrote his lab reports. Then came Jason, 15M, who explained how Lucas had manipulated the debate team rankings by intimidating younger members into deliberately losing against him. The most devastating testimony came from Ryan, Lucas's supposed best friend. Under the gentle questioning of Ms. Chen, Ryan broke down and admitted that he'd been trapped in Lucas's web of manipulation for years. He wasn't really a willing accomplice. Lucas had been blackmailing him too, using an embarrassing incident from 7th grade as leverage to force Ryan to act as his lookout and alibi. Through tears, Ryan described how Lucas had systematically built his perfect image. He deliberately cultivated relationships with teachers, volunteered for high-profile activities, and maintained his grades not through genuine effort, but through a complex system of threats and favors. He'd chosen his victims carefully: students who had something to lose, whose parents would believe Lucas's pristine reputation over their child's word. Mr. Davidson explained that they'd only discovered this pattern because of a new security system installed over the summer. The previous cameras had blind spots that Lucas had carefully mapped out. The new ones were smaller, more numerous, and covered areas he didn't know about. Nick's incident on the stairs had happened in front of one of these new cameras, finally exposing what had been happening in the shadows. As I sat there, I thought about all the signs I'd ignored. The expensive new clothes Lucas suddenly had, claiming they were gifts from debate team friends. The way certain students would cross the street to avoid passing our house. The times I'd found wads of cash in his room and accepted his explanation about tutoring younger students. I'd been so invested in the image of my perfect son that I'd become blind to the reality right in front of me. Officer Miller quietly explained that given the evidence of extortion and physical assault, they had no choice but to involve the juvenile justice system. The Wilsons had already pressed charges, and other families would likely come forward. My son, my precious, perfect Lucas, was facing serious consequences, and for the first time, I couldn't defend him. More importantly, I no longer wanted to. Back home that evening, our house felt like a museum of lies. Every trophy, every certificate, every smiling photograph mocked me with the truth behind their acquisition. While Lucas was sequestered in his room after being suspended pending further investigation, I sat in our living room, my real estate files untouched, replaying years of memories through this new, horrifying lens. I remembered the time Lucas's middle school counselor, Mrs. Hayes, 58F, had tried to discuss concerns about his manipulative tendencies. I had dismissed her observations, even requesting a different counselor for Lucas. When Kelly, 16F, a former friend, suddenly stopped coming over last year, Lucas had convinced me she was just jealous of his academic success. Now I wondered what he had done to her. My phone kept buzzing with messages from other parents, some expressing shock, others sharing stories they'd heard from their children, but had been afraid to bring up given Lucas's sterling reputation. Madison's mother, 43F, revealed how her daughter had been having anxiety attacks before debate team meetings. Chris's father, 46M, described how his son had been giving up his lunch money for months, but was too ashamed to tell anyone. The most gutting message came from my sister Rachel, 37F, who had tried to tell me last Christmas that something seemed off about Lucas's behavior. I had accused her of being jealous of my parenting success and hadn't spoken to her since. Now, reading her gentle, "Are you okay?" text, I broke down completely. As night fell, I found myself outside Lucas's door. I could hear him in there, not crying or showing remorse, but calmly typing on his computer, as if this were just another ordinary evening. That's when another chilling thought hit me. What if he was already planning his next manipulation? What if he was reaching out to his victims, trying to silence them before they could come forward with more evidence? I realized that my years of blind support and unwavering defense had enabled his behavior. By refusing to see any flaws in my son, I had helped create the monster he'd become. The perfect child I thought I'd raised was actually a master manipulator who had fooled everyone, especially his own mother. The weight of my failure as a parent pressed down on me like a physical force. I had to face the fact that while I'd been congratulating myself on raising a perfect son, I'd actually been nurturing something much darker. And now, other children had paid the price for my willful blindness. The next few days unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare. The story spread through Ashland like wildfire, impossible to contain in our small community. Parents who had once begged for Lucas to tutor their children now crossed the street when they saw me coming. My real estate business took an immediate hit. 3 clients canceled listings, not wanting to work with the bully's mother. The school investigation deepened, revealing more victims. Twins Michael and Ashley, 15M, 15F, came forward about how Lucas had manipulated the student council elections, forcing them to withdraw their candidacy through elaborate threats. Then, there was Olivia, 16F, who had given up her spot as debate team captain after Lucas discovered her struggling brother's secret battle with addiction and threatened to expose it. The juvenile court intake meeting was scheduled for next week, but the school board wasn't waiting. They called an emergency session to address the pattern of bullying. Looking at the evidence compiled by Mr. Davidson and Ms. Chin, the scope of Lucas's actions was staggering. For nearly 2 years, he had operated what amounted to a sophisticated extortion ring within Ashland High, all while maintaining his image as the perfect student. At home, Lucas remained eerily calm. When I tried to discuss what he'd done, he attempted to manipulate me just as he had everyone else, spinning elaborate explanations and trying to paint himself as misunderstood. But now that I could see through his facade, his tactics were painfully obvious. Every tear shed was calculated, every remorseful word carefully chosen for maximum effect. The final straw came when I discovered he'd been using my credit card to order food deliveries for his victims, not out of kindness, but as another form of control. He'd send unexpected deliveries to their homes, a subtle reminder that he knew where they lived, that he could reach them anytime. The realization that he'd turned even simple acts of seeming generosity into tools of intimidation made me physically sick. I knew then that I couldn't handle this alone. After years of priding myself on being a strong single mother, I had to admit that I needed help both for myself and for my son. His behavior went beyond typical teenage rebellion or bullying. There was something methodical and calculated about his actions that suggested deeper psychological issues, ones that I had either missed or refused to see. That night, I made two crucial phone calls. The first was to Dr. Marcus, 52M, a highly recommended adolescent psychologist in Portland. The second was to my sister Rachel, swallowing my pride to ask for the support I should have accepted long ago. It was time to face reality. My son needed serious intervention, and I needed to completely reimagine my role as his mother. The juvenile court hearing revealed even more troubling details. District Attorney Hammond, 49F, presented a case that painted a clear picture of Lucas's systematic abuse of power. Over 20 students had provided statements, and Ms. Chin had compiled a detailed report of behavioral incidents that had previously been dismissed or overlooked due to Lucas's carefully maintained reputation. What struck me hardest was Nick's testimony. His parents had initially been hesitant to let him speak, but he insisted. Despite still wearing a neck brace from the fall, he spoke with remarkable composure about the months of torment he'd endured. He described how Lucas had discovered his struggles with dyslexia and threatened to expose him to the whole school, demanding weekly payments to keep quiet. The money had come from Nick's college savings account, which he'd accessed without his parents' knowledge. Dr. Marcus attended the hearing and presented his initial psychological evaluation of Lucas. His findings were devastating. Lucas showed concerning patterns of manipulative behavior and a marked lack of empathy. He recommended an intensive therapeutic program at a specialized facility in Colorado, one that dealt specifically with troubled teenagers who exhibited similar patterns of behavior. The judge, Honor Rebecca Martinez, 61F, listened to all testimony with grave attention. When it came time for her decision, she didn't mince words. Lucas would be required to attend the therapeutic program in Colorado for a minimum of 6 months, followed by strict probation. He would need to make financial restitution to his victims, complete extensive community service, and undergo regular psychological evaluations. Additionally, upon his eventual return to school, he would be barred from holding any leadership positions or participating in competitive activities. Lucas maintained his composed facade throughout most of the hearing, but I saw it crack when Judge Martinez announced he would be leaving for Colorado within the week. For the first time, he looked genuinely frightened, not of punishment, but of losing control. His carefully constructed world of manipulation was being dismantled, and he was powerless to stop it. The hardest part was watching the other parents comfort their children while I sat alone, grappling with my role in enabling my son's behavior. Jennifer Wilson, Nick's mother, approached me after the hearing. Instead of the anger I expected, she showed unexpected compassion, acknowledging how difficult it must be to face these truths about my own child. Her kindness only made me feel more ashamed of how I'd initially attacked her family's credibility. The morning Lucas left for Colorado was surreal. Our home, once filled with the trappings of his false achievements, had been stripped bare. I'd removed every trophy, every certificate, every reminder of the lie we'd been living. My sister Rachel came to help with the drive to the airport, providing the strength I wasn't sure I had. Back at Ashland High, the healing process was beginning. Mr. Davidson implemented new anti-bullying measures, with Ms. Chen leading workshops on recognizing and reporting intimidation. The students Lucas had terrorized were slowly reclaiming their spaces. Ryan rejoined the debate team, this time on his own terms. Nick, still recovering physically, started a support group for students dealing with bullying. My own healing was more complicated. I started seeing Dr. Parker, 45F, a therapist specializing in parent trauma. During our sessions, I confronted the painful truth that my desperate desire to be the perfect single mother had made me complicit in Lucas's behavior. I created an environment where appearances mattered more than authenticity, where success was more important than character. The community's reaction continued to surprise me. While some parents remained distant, others reached out. Hannah, 42F, whose daughter had been one of Lucas's earliest victims, invited me to join a parent support group. Grace, 38F, another single mother, shared her own struggles with recognizing troubling behavior in her child. These connections helped me realize I wasn't alone in facing difficult truths about my child. The reports from Colorado were mixed. Lucas initially tried to manipulate the program staff, but their experience with similar cases meant his usual tactics failed. His therapist, Dr. Turner, 55M, reported moments of genuine breakthrough interspersed with periods of resistance. It was clear that real change would take time. There would be no quick fix for patterns of behavior that had developed over years. At work, I had to rebuild my reputation in the real estate community. I took a different approach now, being honest about my situation when clients asked. To my surprise, this authenticity often strengthened my connections with people rather than pushing them away. Several clients even shared their own parenting struggles, creating unexpected bonds of understanding. The hardest part was accepting that I couldn't fix everything. Some relationships were permanently damaged. Some trust would never be rebuilt. The perfect life I thought I created had been an illusion, but maybe that was for the best. Real growth, I was learning, couldn't happen in the shallow soil of perfection. 1 year after that fateful day in Mr. Davidson's office, I stood in the arrival terminal at Portland International Airport, waiting for Lucas to return from Colorado. The person who walked through those gates wasn't the polished, perfect son I convinced myself I had, but rather a teenager still struggling with his demons, yet finally beginning to face them honestly. The reintegration process was carefully structured. Lucas would be attending a different school in nearby Medford, where Mr. Peterson, 47M, the principal, was aware of his history and had experience with similar cases. He would continue his therapy with Dr. Marcus, now doing both individual and family sessions. The juvenile probation officer, Ms. Taylor, 39F, would monitor his progress closely. Nick had fully recovered physically, though his parents told me he still had occasional nightmares. When Lucas wrote him an apology letter from Colorado, Nick's response was remarkably mature. He hoped Lucas would get the help he needed, but he didn't want any further contact. I respected that boundary completely, understanding that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. The changes in our home life were profound. Gone were the pressure-filled expectations of perfection. Instead, we focused on honesty, no matter how uncomfortable. When Lucas struggled with impulses to manipulate situations, we discussed them openly rather than pretending everything was fine. Progress was slow and non-linear, with setbacks and steps forward happening in an unpredictable dance. My relationship with Rachel strengthened through all of this. She became not just my sister but my closest ally, helping me navigate the complexities of parenting a child who was both victim and perpetrator of his own carefully constructed illusions. Through her, I learned that true support sometimes means challenging the stories we tell ourselves about our children. Looking back at who I was that day in Mr. Davidson's office, desperately defending my son's perfect image, I barely recognized that person. The security footage hadn't just exposed Lucas's behavior, it had forced me to confront my own role in creating an environment where appearance mattered more than truth. The hardest lesson I learned was that sometimes being a good parent means accepting that your child isn't who you wanted them to be, but rather supporting them in becoming who they actually are, flaws and all. I don't know what the future holds for Lucas or for our family. There are no guaranteed happy endings in real life. But I do know that whatever comes next, it will be built on a foundation of truth rather than perfection. And maybe that's the most important lesson from all of this, that real growth can only happen when we're brave enough to face reality, no matter how much it hurts.